Well, I would like to welcome you back to the second half of today's mini medical school, and welcome Dr. Faith Fitzgerald. Faith Fitzgerald's a master clinician. There's none better as diagnostician. She will make diagnosis of babesiosis at a glance fend off the mortician. This internist makes thought, not incisions. With her brain, she makes treatment decisions. She's a master therein and a leader within the American College Physicians. Faith's a student of history as well, of great Tsars and Tsarinas can tell when they took their last breath and the cause of their death. Many falsehoods and hype she'll dispel. Sherlock Holmes she's a fan of, you know. This famed sleuth, like great doctors, could show by his insight and views, the most hidden of clues, solve the case, the true answer bestow. And that's what's going to happen this morning. Dr. Fitzgerald, thank you.
Dr. Rogers showed you the wave of the future. I am going to ask you to swim with me in the wave of the past. And we do it through this device, which is called the Magical Medical History Tour. It is audience participation, but with the cautionary, which is that there are among you, and you may not realize this, obsessive-compulsive people. And in sequence, I'm going to present to you, as a resident or an intern would to me present a case, a very famous dead person, all of whom are characterized by extraordinary achievement and energy into great age. And I'm going to ask you who the patient is. I will ask the obsessive-compulsives and their neighbors, who are asked to put hands over the mouths of those inside. Don't shout out the name as soon as you think you know. It ruins it for everybody else. Just sit on it. Then I'll ask what the diagnosis is, and a lot of this, by the way, is speculative, since some of these patients went to their reward before modern medicine. And then a little bit extra, because it's such fun for me to do. Now, I should warn you, I have this thing loaded up with so many little special effects that it may stall. And if it does, you're just going to have to be patient with me. I'm old. So, here's our first patient. This is a 30-year-old man. Well, he's not old, Faith, yes, but he will be. 30-year-old man who hesitated while giving a speech. He appeared to be confused. He fumbled with his notes, and then he just sat down and covered his face with his hands. It was a major shame for him. He'd had a lifelong speech impediment, and he struggled to overcome it. And both on this occasion and others to follow, he'd periodically become almost incapacitated, and then he would do what some of us do, he'd go to bed for days at a time. And by the time he was in his early 50s, he was generally considered a failure in his chosen work. He was born 2 months prematurely. His mother was an American socialite, and his father was a British politician. Both of them neglected him. He was a poor student at school, was told he wouldn't amount to anything. His father died, and his father died demented when the patient was 21 years old. He began his career as a soldier because he couldn't get into any other college. And he escaped from prison at the age of 25, which made him a popular hero. Now, he was not into wellness. He drank and smoked heavily, was very fat. He suffered a variety of things, including appendicitis, at least one heart attack, several bouts of pneumonia, inguinal hernia, typhoid, multiple strokes, and was once hit by a car because he looked the wrong way before crossing the street in New York. And of course, he was English, so he looked the wrong way. I don't have a physical examination for the period of the present illness, which was, you remember, that he couldn't give a talk. These were his parents, father and mother, you can figure that out. He was active in many things in spite of his lifelong history of multiple illnesses. He was an accomplished bricklayer. He was an honorary member of the Royal Academy of Art and a prolific painter. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. And he became an American citizen at the age of 88. He said these were all he had to give in a time of great crisis. Okay, who is this? Yes, it is. And you can see he lived a long time. He was in his 90th year when he died. He was a transatlantic man, even in Genesis. His mother was an American heiress named Jenny Jerome, and she married an English aristocrat and politician, Lord Randolph Churchill. He was an appalling student, according to all of his elementary school teachers, and could not get into the college to which his class would have allowed him, that is Eton or Cambridge or Oxford. No, he went to Sandhurst because he wanted to be a soldier and couldn't get into anything else. And then he went to war and had a wonderful time. Oh, he loved it. He had this wonderful saying, nothing in life is so exhilarating as being shot at without results. And he used to send these messages home describing what was going on in his little war in Afghanistan. And he became a journalistic correspondent in South Africa. And this was during the Boer War, when the English, who demanded the imperium over South Africa, were facing the Dutch settlers who had been there earlier, who wanted power over South Africa. And he was actually captured by the Boers, and he was put in a prison camp. And then he made a famous escape. Up the window from the men's loo. Out he goes. And he became an English national hero because he did escape, and he therefore entered politics, like his father, as a national hero, and was immediately elected as a member of Parliament, simply because he was a national hero. This is the wanted poster that was put out by the Boer government, and the only comment Churchill had on that was he was worth more than 25 pounds. But he was not caught. It was an inauspicious beginning, however. Upon his maiden speech to the House of Commons after he was elected, and he was very young when he was elected, it was a disaster. He could not give a speech. And some think this was because of his illness, which was a lifelong one, which recurrently plagued him throughout his career. So what was the diagnosis? That is, what happened that Winston Churchill couldn't talk? Say again? A lot of whispering going on out there. Actually, today he would be diagnosed with manic depressive disease, bipolar, which a great many highly creative and active people had. He described it in his diaries as being episodically immobilized by depression, which he called the black dog. And if he could not do a piece of work, he would simply say, sorry, the black dog is visiting, and go back to bed. On the other hand, if you look at his accomplishments, the guy's superhuman. He was member of House of Commons, Minister of Munitions, Secretary of State for War and Air, Chancellor of the Exchequer, from which he was fired, by the way, when the new government came in, and he said famously, I have just become the ex-chancellor of the Exchequer. That's finance. He was Home Secretary, Secretary of State, First Lord of the Admiralty, twice, Prime Minister, twice, soldier, journalist, author, and artist, and P.S., that bit about the Nobel Prize would have taken some of you by surprise, but he won it for literature. And it seems to have been one of his incidental accomplishments to win the Nobel, to the point where people don't even think of it. Things didn't go smoothly. He was out of government for a while, mostly in the interwar years after World War I and before World War II, and he called these his wilderness years because nobody wanted him. And during this time, he made a lot of trouble. he spoke and wrote of the growing threat of Hitler's National Socialism, and because of the devastating effects of the First World War, England was not ready to enter into a second, and with the same enemy. And so we're desperately trying to make peace, and they saw all of Churchill's attacks on Hitler and National Socialism as warmongering. Well, in a sense, he was. And when war came, he became prime minister at the age of 66. He'd overcome his difficulty with public speaking, obviously. And does anyone know who wrote this? He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. That was our guy, who moved and got accepted the Declaration of Honorary American Citizenship given to Winston Churchill in 1963. He was then in his 80s and ill and could not come, but he had, on many of his transatlantic visits to our country during the Second War, actually addressed Parliament, or, in our case, Congress. And on one occasion, in 1941, he said, "I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been an American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have gotten here on my own."
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Sweat. Now, he had many other illnesses in his long life, as I've told you, and one of these has given rise to an inspirational story which involves the history of medicine. And it begins in Scotland. And this was years before Sir Winston became a prominent man, actually said to have occurred when he was a little boy. And the story is about a Scottish farmer who saves an English child from drowning in a bog. And the child's noble father rewards the humble rescuer by financing the farmer's son's medical education. The Scottish boy grows up, goes to medical school, and makes a great discovery. Ta-da! Years later, the English child, now a man, contracts pneumonia and nearly dies until he is saved by therapy with the Scottish boy's discovery. The English boy, Winston Churchill. He got pneumonia following an Allied conference in Tehran with Roosevelt and Stalin, and was dangerously sick to the point where people thought he would die. And it was his father in the story, Lord Randolph, who rewarded the Scottish farmer for saving his son's life. And who was the farmer's son then? Alexander Fleming, discoverer of penicillin. Now, Fleming was really untidy, which is what led to his great success. In September of 1928, he'd noticed an old agar plate of the bacillus staphylococcus, with which you are all familiar, and it had been contaminated by a mold because he left it out, just sitting on a windowsill. And around the sites of the mold, there was no staphylococcus. So he thought maybe there's something in the mold that impairs the growth of staphylococcus. And he published a paper in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in 1929. Which either nobody read or nobody paid attention to. Until 1935, when Oxford scientists finally got around to reading Fleming's paper and, unlike him, realized its potential. And they pursued the clue and they developed penicillin, because the mold was penicillium that was killing the staphylococcus, and developed it as an antibiotic. And Florey and Chain and Fleming all shared the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1945, which was an extraordinary time. This was the first real antibiotic after streptomycin, which had so many terrible side effects that it was seldom used. It's a great story. Yeah. Beware the internet. Churchill, his physician probably unethically kept a careful diary. Lord Brain, his name was. And Lord Brain described the treatment of the pneumonia, which was with sulfa, which is an older antibacterial, not penicillin. And the Scottish farmer story is a total fable. Okay. Now, Churchill, as you know, led the British people to victory. And when he died at age 90, having just quit Parliament the year before to go and die, he received a state funeral. This was the first given to any commoner since that of the Duke of Wellington, who had defeated Napoleon's army at Waterloo. The most moving part, and I don't have a film of it, but wish I had, is that when his funeral bier was taken by boat down the Thames, all the cranes at the side of the Thames bowed. Yeah. And throughout his life, he had to struggle to defeat this black dog. He could not be disabled during the war because literally he was the only one left who believed that Britain would survive. And he infused the British people with his extraordinary optimism and determination, and called on this dog the British Bulldog, and said this: never, 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 never give in, except for principles of honor and good sense. And here's what Winston Spencer Churchill said to his people when Great Britain stood alone against Hitler, alone, the only nation now opposed to Hitler.
So bear ourselves to lift the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for a thousand years. Men will still say, this was their finest hour.
There's a British marching song called the British Grenadier. And the words to it are these: some talk of Alexander and some of Hercules, of Hector and Lysander, and such great names as these. But of all the world's great heroes, there's none that can compare with a row-tow-tow-tow-tow-tow to the British Grenadier. And I think none compare very well either to Winston Churchill, who was a great Englishman, and, depending on how you sing this song, My Country 'Tis of Thee, or God Save the Queen, is also a great American, and worked up until 1 year before his death. Okay, let's do another one. This is a 90-year-old woman who died after spending half a century in bed. She outdid Winston Churchill. From age 34 to 36, she had undertaken some work abroad during which she contracted an epidemic fever. And she returned home, and getting off the train, actually, on returning home, she said, I'm having palpitations. And she also had headache and shortness of breath and some chest pain. And then periodically, she'd start to pant and paralyze. Well, her doctor, who saw her, said her heartbeat was too fast and she should lie down and not get up until it was normal. So she follows his advice, working entirely from her bed, couch, special coach, or wheelchair for the remaining 54 years of her life. She developed a backache during the long course of her invalidism. This was before a sleep train. And it was treated with opium. So she was kind of, much of the time. But she continued working, and at age 90, having won unparalleled honors in her country and become famous abroad, she died demented in her bed of heart failure. Now, the family history was this. Her father inherited his wealth from a non-relative. And he was so grateful to that fellow that he changed his last name and that of his entire family from Shore, which was his name, to that of his benefactor. Our patient, never married and never had children, which is kind of lucky. Her family was traveling when she was born, and she was named after a city in which that occurred. She was a natural student. She was acquainted with the classics, and this was at a time when women were not highly educated, because if they got too smart, they might take over, I suppose. The Bible and politics, and she had, unusual for a woman of her time, a particular love of mathematics and statistics. Then God told her, when she was 17, that she had a vocation, and she pursued it despite the objections of her family that it was too low class for a woman of her stature. She went to train in Egypt and then in Germany, and then, coming back to England, she became superintendent of what they called an establishment for gentle women. It's kind of like an assisted aid residence, but you only take gentle women. And she cut the costs of that by 50%. She was then asked by the Secretary of War of Great Britain to undertake the administration and improvement of military hospitals, which were awful. Terrible. She was highly accomplished and honored, and through her life she published 200 books and pamphlets, was consultant on army medical care to 2 other nations, including ours, by the way, began a school, was elected a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, the only woman at the time, became an honorary member of the American Statistical Society, because she was a member of the Royal Statistical Society, and she was given the Royal Red Cross, which was an honor, won the Order of Merit, and was the first woman to receive this, and was given the freedom of the City of London. This is part of a statue in honor of her and those she served. This is not what she looked like, by the way. No. These were her patients. And Alfred, Lord Tennyson, actually wrote a poem about an episode in the war during which she did her famous work. And part of it is, theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. We mispronounce it. We say do or die. No, do and die in the original. And when Edison invented the phonograph, he had this wonderful idea of going out and recording all of the most famous people of his time. And he recorded Alfred, Lord Tennyson. And it's not a good recording, but for its time it was brilliant. Now, in our country, Henry Longfellow wrote about her famous nickname. And her nickname was that she had this with her when she worked. And finally, if those of you who do the New York Times crossword and other Sudoku and things like that, this is a cryptopictogram. It's an anagram for her name, which means using the same letters and changing the words. Flit on, cheering angel. And here is the pictogram part. Oh, now you shout it out ahead of time. Would the neighbor please take action? What'd she say? That's who this was. Born in Florence, and the last name of the shore's benefactor was, for heaven's sake, Nightingale, so that's how she became Florence Nightingale. And she lived from 1820 to 1910, 90 years old. And Longfellow wrote a poem called The Lady with the Lamp, and now we call Florence Nightingale the Lady with the Lamp. It was a bad poem, listen to it. A lady with a lamp shall stand in the great history of the land, a noble type of good, heroic womanhood. Yeah. Anyhow, it was a Turkish lamp. So it had this little paper on it that was accordion-like. Now, and this occurred during the Crimean War, which was an interesting war. Russia declared war on Turkey because Turkey, the Ottoman Empire at the time, wanted to invade Slavic lands. And Slavic peoples, even though they weren't Russian, were Orthodox Christians. And the Tsar of Russia believed that he was appointed by God to protect Orthodox Christians. So he declared war on Turkey. Turkey, Britain, and France then declared war on Russia. And both sides fought very badly, though heroically. And British casualties were immense. Now, interestingly enough, 4,600 of the British troops died in battle. 13,000 were wounded but survived, but 17,500 died of disease. It was the great thing that killed these soldiers in the Crimea. So when she heard about this, Florence Nightingale gathered up some other nurses and went to Crimea to a place called Scutari Hospital. It was in a suburb of what was then Constantinople. And she and the 38 other nurses she brought in with her in mid-19th century cared for the British casualties of the Crimean War, including some of the surviving members of the Charge of the Light Brigade. And it's good she went, because when she walked into it, she found that soldiers were lying on the bare floors. They were surrounded by filth and vermin. They were cared for by slovenly male nurses who actually stole things from them, including their food, and given dirty, if any, water and rotten food. So she demanded, A1, better hygiene, better food, better water, better equipment, and more gentle nursing than picking the pockets of your patients as they lay groaning on the ground. And more than that, what she did was, because of her love of mathematics and statistics, collect data. And she utilized that system to show, absolutely convincingly, that her reforms led to a decreased mortality from this astonishing 60% death rate if you were admitted, down to 2% within 6 months. This is the most successful therapy ever applied in a hospital. And she became a national hero because these who lived were the sons of men and women in Britain and the soldiers of Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria made a big fuss about her, and the English press made a big fuss about her, and she became immensely popular and famous. So, she comes back to England, and she was asked there to reform the military hospitals in England. And it was she who said, first do no harm. I mean, some people are taking that back to Hippocrates. First do no harm was Florence Nightingale, the mother of modern nursing. And she set up rules as to how you should behave, and she transformed that profession. Subsequently, she was asked to advise both the Canadian government and, during the Civil War, the U.S. government on Army health. And the U.S. government rewarded her for that by honoring her, and she wrote papers, pamphlets, and the first nursing textbook. And she did all this from her bed. So she'd had fever in the Crimea. Nobody knows what it was. There was a lot of typhus going around. It's spread by lice, and there were a lot of lice. And there can be a relapsing form of typhus where you get over the first part and then it comes and hits you again. Some think because she was in the Crimea it had to be a viral disease called Crimean hemorrhagic fever, but there's no story of hemorrhage. Typhoid fever, which is still seen around a lot, and probably not, or tuberculosis, because everybody else had it in that era. But none of them could last over half a century. And yet allow, in this putatively sick and bedridden woman, such prodigious accomplishment. Establishing nursing school, writing nursing texts, giving advice to other nations, just extraordinary. So some have supposed that what she had was what in the 19th and 18th century was called neurasthenia, and which we would call, unkindly I think, hysteria, hypochondria, neuromyalgia. Perhaps the most modern iteration of it is chronic fatigue syndrome, or somatization, that is having bodily symptoms generated by the mind. And the idea of neurasthenia was generated by a New Yorker, a neurologist, who described it in 1869, and he said it was caused by nervous exhaustion. And it had to be that people who could get nervously exhausted must be the intelligentsia and the aristocracy of their time, very refined people, because, the common plod didn't have enough nerves to get exhausted. And he thought it affected women more than men, which it did, because of the stunning speed of steam power and the availability of the periodical press and the telegraph and the sciences, which had all increased the mental activity of women, and we just broke down under it and went to bed. But there were a lot of people in the spa movement here and elsewhere who just spent the rest of their lives going from spa to spa to spa to get cured. And it came up with some handy things like Kellogg's cornflakes and Graham's crackers, because they were both big spa runners, and they created special foods that would cure you of your neurasthenia. So Florence Nightingale was two women. She was that woman who made one of the most significant impacts on medicine of all the practitioners of medicine, and created a new profession without which we would be desperately in trouble. But at the same time, she was this other woman, depressed, in despair, and in bed. The Lady of the Lamp. This is an 84-year-old scientist, and he had chest pain and difficulty breathing. For 12 months, he was largely bedridden. He needed opiates during paroxysms of pain. He developed a fever. 3 days later, he had left chest pain, cough, and shortness of breath, and that lasted a week. And his pain and dyspnea resolved. Dyspnea, shortness of breath. His family grew hopeful. Unfortunately, no. His doctor said an imposthume has formed in his lungs, which has now burst. And he discharged a quantity of matter which he continued to throw up while he had power. But as that failed, the organs of respiration became gradually oppressed, and he became lethargic. Now, he had a rich past medical history. He probably had severe psoriasis. He certainly had polyarticular gout. He had eye problems. He'd had pleurisy. He had stones, kidney stones, and bladder stones. And he never wanted to do what he did. He was born an Englishman, and then he died an American. And what he wanted to in school was to become a sailor. But there were no big jobs as a sailor, so he had a variety of other occupations. He was a candle maker and a cartoonist, a postmaster, a shopkeeper, a journalist, an author, an inventor, a congressman, a civic activist, an environmentalist, a printer, and a diplomat. And he was internationally renowned as a scientist. He was the most famous scientist of his time. And when he was 53 years old, he got an honorary degree from St. Andrews University in Scotland, and it said he was a doctor, and he kind of liked that, so he insisted on being called doctor after that. And he has been called by his biographer, Carl Van Doren, the harmonious human multitude, because of the vast breadth of his many gifts. Okay, here's his chest x-ray. Well, we don't have one, obviously, because they weren't invented yet. But if they had been invented, this is what his might have looked like. The little clue there, the hint, is that that area of the lung, it does not have air in it. It has pus in it. So, he asked his daughter to make his bed so he might have a dignified death. And his daughter, who loved him, said she hoped he'd live many more years. And he said, I hope not. And his hope was fulfilled. Passed into coma and quietly died. It's kind of nice. He established these in his city, a fire service, a hospital, and a library. This was his most well-known experiment, and it was immediately copied by a European scientist who was electrocuted. Who is this? This is Ben Franklin. What an extraordinary guy. And the diagnosis? Well, if I tell you that imposthume means abscess, he'd had pneumonia. It gathered in a pus pocket in his lungs. It ruptured and it overwhelmed him. Now here's what he did, this American Leonardo da Vinci. His contributions to medicine alone would qualify him for great honor. He founded the Pennsylvania Hospital, which is still in operation. He articulated the placebo effect of electric therapy. Mesmer had come along saying electricity is really good, and other people were trying to sell the electric shock, really, as therapy for everything from fever to obesity to impotence. Impotence was particularly possible because, in fact, electric shock can do things. His brother had a urethral stricture, and so he designed a flexible urethral catheter because his brother was being straight-cathed, which hurt a lot since the straight cath was made out of metal. Yeah. He had started, you remember, as a printer and was around a lot of lead print. And while he himself was not affected, he noticed that his printer helpers had trouble with walking and with dropping of the wrist drop, which they called the dangles, which is a classic sign of lead poisoning. He advocated for smallpox inoculation when many were against it, and he invented the bifocals. He also debunked Mesmer's animal magnetism, that is hypnotism. He was the guy that said, wear white in summer and darker clothes in winter because white reflects heat and dark absorbs it. Good on you. I keep thinking Dr. Hirsch has something to do with this. He described something called Auschwitz sign, Auschwitz was a dermatologist 100 years later who said if you pick at psoriasis, you may get tiny points of bleeding. And he had that. But really, he worked with electricity in many ways. He invented the lightning rod, he studied weather, and he studied the course of the Gulf Stream. He developed an early form of swim fins. And he invented, of course, the Franklin stove, and it was he had to do something wrong, that proposed daylight savings time. He also created street lighting, fire service, and insurance, the post office, a circulating library, the University of Pennsylvania, the American Philosophical Society, and Pennsylvania Hospital. Oh, yeah. And, P.S. There was something else he did. He was already in his late 80s, and he both helped to construct and also is the only person to have signed all 4 of the documents that helped create the United States. The Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance, Amity, and Commerce with France, to whom he was ambassador, that allowed the French Navy to help us beat the British, without whom we couldn't. He did sign the Treaty of Peace between England, France, and the United States, and he is an original signer on the Constitution of the United States. And, of course, he wrote Poor Richard's Almanac and gave us some of our most trite phrases to say again and again. There was a question to his character, however, because when he was in Britain, he lived in a house from 1757 to 1762. And in 1998, doing some work, a workman dug up 10 bodies hidden beneath the London home in which Franklin had stayed. And they thought, The owner of the landlady's son was a doctor named William Hewson, and the son-in-law, is suspected of having run an illicit anatomy school there. And then, because it was illegal, he brought the specimens to her house and buried them. And Franklin may or may not have known anything about it, or he knew, participated, and didn't care because he was so curious. I wonder how that would have worked out if Franklin had had his way. The harmonica. And he saw people creating notes by rubbing the lips of wine glasses and thought to himself, that's neat. And so he literally created a machine that did that. And he said it was his favorite invention. He had his tercentenary in Philadelphia 9 years ago, and a big fuss was made about Ben Franklin. Of course, he was by then dead, and he's buried in the Christ Church graveyard, Philadelphia. Who's been? Anybody? It's kind of simple. Now, it could have been more interesting because he wrote his own epitaph, just to, preparing. Yeah, when he was 22, it was not used. And what it says is, the body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. Now, did he believe in reincarnation? Who knows? He was a true American genius. And one of the best things said about him was said by the French, who loved him. He snatched the lightning from the skies and the scepter from tyrants. Good old Ben Franklin. I've got one more and we're running over time. What's your pleasure? Okay, here we go. This is a 75-year-old woman who was told by her doctor that she was anemic, and she had a bone marrow aspirate, which looks at the genesis place of the red cells, white cells, and platelets, and it showed she wasn't making any of those things. Well, she said, I'm too busy to bother with this, continued her schedule, and she was just too busy to be sick. 2 years after the initial diagnosis, she had the low blood count and red cells, low white cells, low platelets, and she was now treated with prednisone. And then she had a transfusion because she was really profoundly anemic, and she had a bad transfusion reaction, so she was admitted to the hospital. There she goes. She'd had pleurisy as a young woman. Her father died of the complications of chronic alcoholism when she was just a child. And her mother was also seriously depressed and also died when our patient was young. It's a very sad story. And she was raised by her grandmother, who didn't like her and kept calling her ugly. And later she married a man whose mother dominated her. Sounds like something you'll see on TNT. She was educated in the USA and England. She never graduated college. She wanted to go into social work, but she had to marry and give birth to children because that's what women did. She spent much of her early life, however, caring for an invalid husband, and nonetheless managed to become a world traveler. Now, here she is in the hospital following the blood transfusion reaction, and she gives the history of several weeks of cough. This is new. Chest x-ray showed no acute disease. Fever went away. She's discharged. 6 weeks later, she comes back, now with a high fever, and her chest x-ray shows little nodules all over it. Ooh. So they did another bone marrow, specifically to look for tuberculosis, because one, it was common at the time, and two, she went to places all over the world where it was almost inevitable. And they couldn't find it. The acid-fast stain is the specific stain for the bacillus that causes TB. But they thought so likely that they treated her with anti-tuberculous medications anyway. And she continued to have fevers as high as 105. And she was coming on 80 at the time. She was 78. And by her own wish and with the concurrence of her family, she wanted to go home. Nobody argued with this woman. So 3 weeks after discharge, she had a stroke, went into coma, and died. Here's a clue to who she was. She herself described herself as the eyes, ears, and legs for her husband. She kept her maiden name after her marriage. For those of you obsessive-compulsives who are just so desperate to cry out her name, stop. Just stop. She wrote a popular newspaper column called My Day. This one's not hard. Shush. And she worked for this organization and was world famous, and in fact, she'd made personal visits to most places in the world. And here's the absolutely final giveaway, can't be missed clue. Her husband and her uncle both had the same job. This one's not hard. Okay, now. Yeah. This is Eleanor Roosevelt. She came from a political family. Her father, who died of the alcoholism, was in fact a brother to Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy was her uncle, was her best man when she married. And he more or less looked after her. And then she married her fifth cousin, Franklin, another branch of the Roosevelt family, and she nursed him through his acute polio, which left him profoundly paraplegic, by the way. And when he was president, she was the one that traveled the thousands of miles to places where the president should be going as his eyes, ears, and legs, and then reported back to him. In 1933 alone, she traveled 40,000 miles to support the New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt was proposing. And in 1935, she began to write this popular syndicated newspaper column called My Day. How many of you ever read that in the 40s? Yeah. So she worked with many reform organizations, and especially the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she went everywhere. She went into the coal mines of America and down in the coal mines. She sponsored national youth. She went to the South Pacific to visit wounded veterans from the Pacific War, and she'd sit down, talk to them, and then take a message to their parents and mail it to them. Now, one thing that distinguishes her from many, many others of her time was this. This was an opera star who wasn't allowed to sing where she wanted to in 1939. You may guess the reason. She was the first African American to perform at the Metropolitan Opera and was a fantastic singer. But the Daughters of the American Revolution denied her request to appear at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., because she wasn't the right color of American. Well, that really angered Eleanor Roosevelt. So she resigned from the DAR. She said, I'm afraid I've never been a very useful member. And she goes on saying, I am in complete disagreement with the attitude taken in refusing Constitution Hall to a great artist. You have set an example, which seems so unfortunate, and I feel obliged to tell you so and send you my resignation. So she did. And then she arranged for Marian Anderson to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where she sang God Bless America to 75,000 people. And this was a seminal event in the civil rights movement. And this was the site that Martin Luther King chose later to give his I Have a Dream. And she, who became a member of the NAACP, presented Marian Anderson with a medal from it.
December 7th, 1931, a date which will live in infamy.
Well, Franklin Roosevelt could barely hold himself erect. He was that weak. The photographers of the time, who were much more civilized than the shameless photographers of the shameless journals today, would not photograph him either in a wheelchair or falling. There was a gentleman's agreement, and the gentleman kept it. So Eleanor Roosevelt went to war. These are her travels in the Pacific during her First Lady period. And on one occasion, she took her little Scotty with her, Fala. And apparently Fala got left behind on an island. Yeah. And then the word went out that Eleanor Roosevelt had ordered the ship of war to turn around and go back to pick up Fala. And that was a big scandal because it's expensive. It takes that ship of war away from the war. And the Republicans were making a whole big thing out of this, how she's wasteful. And Franklin Roosevelt goes on his fireside chat, and he says, they say many bad things about me, I can take it. They say many bad things about Eleanor. She can take it. But now they've said bad things about my little dog, Fala. And he resents it very much. He's Scottish, and would not have condoned this expenditure. No, Fala came home by another route. But it was a very famous speech, my little dog, Fala. Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't universally liked. As a matter of fact, some people loathed her, and she was often the object of great cruelty. To which her response was, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I love it. And then after Franklin Roosevelt died, Harry Truman appointed her to the U.S. delegate to the United Nations, and she became the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights and was the lead author that helped draft the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is her speaking.
The meticulous study and debate of which this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the product means that it reflects the composite view of the many men and governments who have contributed to its formulation.
You will notice she doesn't say men and women. She knew that would cause trouble in the United Nations. So it was very wise about the whole thing. Okay, what did Eleanor Roosevelt die of? Anybody know? Good, I'll tell you. She had tuberculosis, and it had spread all over her body. In spite of the therapy that they were giving her. Myelofibrosis means that instead of having the rich marrow that produces the red cells, the white cells, and the platelets, which are the things that help you to clot, it's all fiber. And then at the end, she had a stroke. But a bone marrow culture shortly before her death grew tuberculosis. And it was everywhere. Probably picked up on one of her jaunts. It could have been in the coal mines. It could have been in the South Pacific. It could have been anywhere in Europe or anywhere else in the United States. How many of you have visited the FDR Memorial in Washington? Good. It's very special in one way that people don't generally think about. Here's Franklin Roosevelt with his cape on, but sitting on a wheelchair, and that's one remarkable thing. And the other is that there's Eleanor. She is the only First Lady of all the many represented in a presidential memorial in D.C. And so I present to you Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then called the First Lady of the world. It's an Irish tune called I'm Roving, and I'm going to rove now, and I thank you for listening.